I kept telling her this was a kill order. I need protection here in the hospital. They're going to hit me again. And because it was a failed kill order. And a day and a half later, I came out of a coma, immediately called a friend of mine who was one of the people who chiefly helped me develop the cocaine market in the 1980s here. And he got down there with a carload of soldiers. They got me out of the hospital. Because I am a doctor, I was able to sign out against every argument in the world. I didn't care. I needed to get to my home, where upstairs I have a security-based design where no one can get into me. And that's where we got me back. And that's where I started my recovery.
Okay, so that's only 4 years ago. All right, today we are joined by Dr. Hal Bradley, and this is a guest who was introduced to me by the illustrious Pete A. Turner of the Break It Down show. I wanted to shout out Pete and say thank you very much. I believe Dr. Bradley's got a couple interviews with him as well, if you want to check them out. But Dr. Bradley, or Dr. Hal, you have kind of an interesting background.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I want to thank you first and foremost for having me on air with you today. I really appreciate what you are trying to create with the community of podcast showers. It's very important that we get some of these messages out there to our global community and even to our local communities. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Appreciate the interview.
Well, thank you. And your story, this is a weird analogy, but when I was a kid growing up, I would get a hold of any book I could get my hands on at the fair or whatever. I was kind of a poor kid. And a book that I got at the time was Al Capone's Devil Driver.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a fascinating book. It was put out by a church, a religious organization. And this individual who was the driver of Al Capone went to prison. He got straight, and he told his story. And I believe he actually drove during the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, all of that stuff. Your story seems similar outside of the murders. I don't know if anything like that happened, but you kind of ran with the cartels.
Yeah. What happened was in 1969, I was kicked out of school outside of Seattle, Washington for smoking a cigarette on campus, me and two other friends. And back in 1969, they removed you for like a semester for an offense like that, which was very, very erratic and extreme. But nonetheless, my mother, who was raising 3 children at home alone, had a son in Vietnam, my older brother at the time, said, I'm not going to have my son wandering the streets, but I have a friend who owns a mining camp down in Mexico, and I think the experience would be really good for Hal. So I'm going to go ahead and send him down there. So the guy came up to Seattle, picked me up. We flew into Mazatlan, Sinaloa, Mexico, where we were met by a driver, taken into the state of Durango, and I was deposited at this mining camp. Unknown to my mother, this was at a time before the actual cartels were formed, but they were controlled by bosses that would control a region of a territory in Mexico.
What was the name of the mine? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, it's the Anaconda de Mexico Mining Corporation, and the man that took me down there owned 11% of the mines. But in essence, during that time, the mine was nothing more than a front operation for the cultivation of many, many hectares of opium poppies and marijuana grown by the Chouari Indians up in the mountains. So although there was some mining going on, and there were silver and ore concentrates, lead concentrates that were taken to Torreon for smelting and refining, the primary or principal operation was a mafia-controlled environment for the production of heroin and marijuana.
Can we talk about that for a second? Because that is new information, I think, to a lot of people, including me, because I know of the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle, which are the East and West Asian, if you will, opium sources. But I did not know that we were growing opium, or the opium was being grown in Mexico. When did that start? How did that break down?
I'm so glad that you asked that question, Eric. What happened was during World War II and the European campaign and the South Pacific campaign, our troops were running out of morphine that was being needed for the treatment of wounded combat veterans or individuals at the time. And so the Department of Justice, sent down a team to Mexico to talk to farmers down there to agriculturally grow poppies for the production of morphine base that could be converted into morphine and used for our campaigns. So we actually started the heroin trade business in Mexico in the 1940s. Our government did this. What happened was, after the campaigns ended, we were successful in the war. They didn't go back to Mexico and have them retrained to grow something else. So now, today, by 1969, you're talking about the beginning of third generation farmers that were cultivating poppies down there because that's what they were taught to do. They weren't re-taught to grow something else. So we, in essence, created the heroin trade in our country by not following through and altering the course of a destiny defined by World War II.
I want to dig a little deeper into that because I'm a jaded person, and I do a couple other shows. One of them called Proven Conspiracies, another one called America's Untold Stories. And there was something called Operation X, which literally was funding the CIA. And before that, Office of Special Services, or whatever, OSS, which involved, go figure, poppy and opium. So I guess one of my first questions for you is, with the CIA connectivity, and I did want to get into it since you were dealing with this stuff in the 80s.
Oh, yeah. And the 90s.
And the 90s, I apologize. Yes. That was a high point of CIA involvement in drugs in Latin America, because I'm going to say Central, South, big spread. Was the Mexico poppy related to the CIA over the decades?
I cannot confirm or deny that particular question. As you know, I spent 17 years undercover operational throughout Central America and Mexico. I worked with CIA agents, DEA, U.S. Customs. I also worked with other alphabet agencies, if you will, under the umbrella of the Department of Justice. And this, of course, is after spending 15 years in the cartels in Mexico as a smuggler, and then later the largest cocaine trafficker in the history of the Pacific Northwest. I built the corridors and all the markets up here for the Sinaloa drug cartel. And to further emphasize that, as Pete has pictures, I don't know if we sent them to you, me with El Chapo back in 41 years ago, when Chapo and I were just marijuana dealers. He was working for the Jalisco cartel, and the man that put together the marijuana industry at the time was a guy named Rafael Quintero, a man I knew personally. And then Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo became the godfather of all the cartels, creating the conglomerate, if you will, of the regional cartels that were now being formed and created. And this was in the late 1970s, early 80s. So your question was, did the CIA have opium involvement or poppy involvement? I don't want to answer that question.
Okay, well, and I might have a bunch of these because
that's fine. I'll answer it.
Kiki Camarana comes up as a very interesting question. Your thoughts, or do you have any knowledge of that case?
Well, absolutely, on both sides. At the time in the 80s, when Kiki Camarena was kidnapped and tortured, horribly tortured, that was done by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the boss of bosses. He's the one that did authorize it. Now, I've seen the show Narcos, and I've seen other programs that give other information, but a lot of this information was conveyed to me by people that were actively involved. I was bringing marijuana out of the state of Jalisco at the time of Kiki's kidnapping, so I was directly in country during the incident. And what we did was DEA stepped in immediately, and the Justice Department stepped in with various other agencies to first locate Kiki, and then second, after Kiki's body was found, to literally put a war in Mexico against the traffickers and the politicians that were responsible for the decision-making to take down a DEA agent.
Didn't matter if we'd ever met him or not. Kiki Camarena was one of us. He was ours. And when he was killed, we knew we were in a war.
And I fled Mexico at that time. I stayed out of that country for about a year. There was about 8 or 9 months after Kiki's body was retrieved, where all hell broke loose down there. And a lot of the traffickers basically had to sit there and self-support off of what they already had across the border in safe houses in the United States during the time of straightening out this problem.
Now, you were still involved on the criminal side at that point, correct?
Oh, yes, I
Okay.
definitely was.
Because I've interviewed both Steve Murphy and Javier Pena.
Wow.
And they're tied into Pablo Escobar, which I believe you have ties to as well. So, sorry to interject, but please continue.
No, I'm really glad you do. And my involvement with Pablo Escobar was doing marketing through the cartels in Mexico, where the kilos were coming up from Pablo. And I also had involvement with Pablo when I was undercover. But getting back to that, what happened to me was in 1991, I had a 38 kilo seizure. One of my guys was moving 38 keys in Seattle that day. And when they opened up the trunk, they expected to see 2 or 3 kilos. Nobody knew there was weight moving through there. And I was moving a quarter to a third of a ton of cocaine through the corridor at that time. And most of the kilos coming out of Mexico would have the Estrella, or they would have a Scorpion stamp on it, or they would have just a lot number, things like that. That was the identification practices for the narcotics agencies, federally funded and ran by the government. But with the soccer balls, that told them that they now had a representative operational in the Pacific Northwest that was specifically moving Don Pablo Escobar's cocaine up here. And that's when they initiated Operation Northern Exposure, which was I was the primary target of Operation Northern Exposure. But anyway, getting back to that, once they found those kilos, they started investigating immediately. All of these agencies, alphabet agencies, got involved up in Washington State, and they said, we need to find out what the hell is going on here. And it didn't take them too long to realize that they had an operator that was moving massive amounts of cocaine in the Pacific Northwest region. And this would be verified by people that were getting arrested and would turn informant.
And this is what year span?
1991 to 1994 was the period of Operation Northern Exposure. Now, I want you to understand, I was not arrested. I went down to Mexico, and I tried to talk to the people that I was directly involved with, saying, look, we're getting heated up. I've already made enough money. Well, my life is documented in the Snohomish County records, how many buildings I owned and businesses I owned and all of that stuff. My life was set. I was done for life. So I went down there to negotiate my release from it. And these are people that I've known since childhood, since 1969. And it's all hugs and handshakes. And yeah, you did a great job. Set up our people and we'll take over at this point. And I got home to 350 kilos of cocaine sitting in my driveway, which is their way of saying, you're not walking away.
Okay, that was my question, because from what I have perceived, I don't know anything about it, firsthand, that you're not allowed. It's kind of like the Italian mafia or whatever. I thought that you're in for life, that there is no see you later, have a nice day.
I thought because we were children and we grew up together when we were young, and they all became drug lords, the people I knew. I mean, I used to ride my burro along the poppy fields with Ramon Arellano Felix when he was 7 years old. So, my ties down there to some of these drug lords is all the way back to our childhood era.
And Felix is the one who became the godfather?
Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo became the godfather of all of them. He's the one that put together the syndicate, if you will, of the territorial cartels. These are now cartels. They're no longer like families that were controlling regions. They came in and created a cartel. And the reason they did this was for political protection. They did it for a lack of competition between one another, which was taking a lot of lives and a lot of other activity that was drawing attention to the cartels. This was the transformation era, and I grew up down there bringing drugs north during this era. I saw the process.
Can you define a cartel?
What a cartel is, it's kind of like what you said earlier about the Italian mafia. You have an allegiance to an organization, a family, quote, family. And the cartels take a territory of Mexico, like you've heard of the Triangle down there, and where you have Chihuahua, Sonora, Sinaloa, and then later Jalisco came into the Triangle. And these are occupied regions by families that end up turning into illegal corporations, if you will. That is what a cartel is. And they are controlled politically, and they are controlled violently. The things that I've witnessed and seen in my lifetime of being on that side of the law are just so horrific. I mean, the art of torture, we called it the University of Medellin, where the Colombians came up into Mexico and taught them torture techniques and torture tactics, informational extraction, things to this nature. So when I started up in the
And
business,
where did the Colombians learn that from? Did they learn it from FARC? I'm curious.
they learned it from the CIA. The CIA actually trained people in Central America and South America the art of extracting information through torturous means. And they were very good at the instruction. I mean, one of the major men responsible for torturing Kiki Camarena, he was the major guy, was originally involved with the Tijuana cartel, which was the Arellano Felix family. I don't know that he was a member of the Arellano Felix family at the time because he was operational in Jalisco and he was directly under Miguel Angel Gallardo. And but the techniques that he used and the tactics that he used were CIA tactics that were implemented into their training on the art of torture. Everything changed after that in Mexico. It used to be if you had a problem with someone, you just walk up, put a bullet in his head, and it was over. Well, they learned other means and methodologies that I have witnessed: acid baths, bodily dismemberment. Oh my God! I once watched 3 dogs eat a man alive, just as an example. I remember seeing bodies dangling off overpasses and being on a cell phone talking to somebody, having to kind of divert the.
I've got to say on that, I mean, because people really want to know, how do you compartmentalize that kind of thing?
Boy, it's a tough question. I think that what happens is as you graduate into the exposure, if you will, of that type of human depravity and torture, you don't get numb to it. You get an understanding, if you will, of it. And that's how you survive it psychologically. You just realize that it's part of the culture that has now been introduced to a community that you came up in. And as a result of that, you graduate to that. That's probably the best way to answer that. It's really difficult today. As you know, I haven't been a criminal for 30 years. I walked away from that life. Government contractor for 17 years undercover. I completed seminary studies while I was in federal prison, became a hospice counselor to federal prisoners that were dying as I was a prisoner myself. And during that era of transitioning into my faith and to serve my world that I now came out to, I still carry the scars and the memories, and I'm a PTSD patient from being captured and tortured, and I was once kidnapped and tortured. I've gone through a lot of things in the service of my country. But getting back to that standard of accepting and understanding that lifestyle, you are graduated into it, as were we all. But it's pretty horrific, and it never leaves you. You just have to find a way to wake up every day and try to do something that can be opposite of something that you survived. That is the purpose of the Crisis Victory show that I created. It was really interesting. It was after I had walked in on my own free will and not under arrest and offered to take down the entire Pacific Northwest corridor. I wasn't some guy that got caught and turned into a rat and decided to start telling on people. I was the guy that said there's only going to be one way to end this, and that's to go to war with a cartel. And the best way to go to a war is in preparation. And who better to prepare that war than Department of Justice? And that was my.
Now, was that part of the plea? I mean, did you go in and then serve time after helping and serve? How did that break down? I'm sorry.
That's a very good question. What happened was they had the largest target in history of the Pacific Northwest walk into the Attorney General's office one day with a very powerful attorney and said, "I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and take this on. By the way, I'm Hal Bradley." And they're going, "Oh my God, Hal Bradley just walked in to the office." So they scrambled to get all these different agencies together that were up there under the umbrella of the DOJ operating on Operation Northern Exposure. We met that afternoon in a large conference room that had a very long table. And here I've got ATF, DEA, IRS, all these different alphabet agencies around the table. And they're all looking at me and they're kind of pissed off because they wanted to take me down. They didn't want me to walk in. And I was, of course, a kingpin status. I was facing life in prison. And I wasn't even thinking of that at the time. I was thinking of preservation of my wife, my children, I went down there specifically to walk away from this life forever. And of course, they don't let you out of it that way. So I had to go to war against them. So my only plan that I could see that,
and that was 93.
I walked in 93. I was sentenced October 19th of 94. That's when I went to prison. But anyway, so the deal was I would help dismantle the Pacific Northwest Corridor and the trafficking based out of Mexico in return for leniency to the courts and working my way down from a life sentence to where I ultimately got it down to where I got it down. But what was interesting about that was after all the dust settled, I was undercover 19 months at that time before my sentencing. And most of that time was outside of the United States.
Oh, okay. So hold on. So you made a deal and you immediately started working before you even served time?
Immediately.
And thus, that's how you could have been tied to Escobar, who died December 2nd, 1993.
Yeah, I was working with DEA and the CIA in an undercover operation in Acapulco. And I remember Raul Arellano Felix flew in from Bogota and came in and he was weeping, literally weeping. And we're going, Jesus Christ, what the hell's going on? And he says, they just killed Don Escobar. That was that day. And we weren't watching TV or news. None of us were even aware that it had happened. So we heard it firsthand from somebody who was in Bogota at the time, down there involved with Don Pablo Escobar. And I don't know that he was an eyewitness to the actual shooting where Don ran out of the window on that rooftop and was killed by Colombian forces with DEA presence. The DEA stepped back to let the shots be fired from the Colombian enforcement agencies so they would be able to take the credit for that. But a lot of the information that was gathered in the relocation, or the location, if you will, of Don Pablo that day was through our intelligence agencies.
Well, Steve Murphy and
yeah, exactly.
Leyva, I believe. Oh, not Leyva, Javier.
Yeah, Javier Pena.
Yeah. I believe they were directly responsible.
They were, and I mean, my hat's off to them. What amazing work that they were able to accomplish and come out alive. Jesus, I mean, it was crazy times. But yeah, that's how I heard about Pablo Escobar being killed. And that night, the CIA were outside of Acapulco photographing aerial drops, planes flying into Mexico, and they were parachuting loads of drugs into Mexico so they could land the planes and clear customs, no problem. It was a fascinating operation. And I was down there working on, I think, a 2,500 kilo buy at that particular trip. I did so many during those first 19 months.
Again, I'm going to throw another name out there, but this would have been while you were working. Did you ever deal with Barry Seal?
He used to smuggle drugs, then he got caught and he became one of the government's most valuable informants in the war against cocaine. But last night in Louisiana, Barry Seal's enemies caught up with him and killed him.
Barrymore Seal. Yeah, boy, look what happened to him, huh? He, when they blew his cover, Oliver North should have kept his goddamn mouth shut. The guy was moving 30,000 kilos that day and got it. It came through. And of course, you've heard of the Mena, Arkansas thing where the CIA was flying the cocaine into Mena, Arkansas. That was all validated. Of course they were. And that's how they were funding the Contra Sandinista situations in Central America. I was actually captured myself in El Salvador and was a prisoner, moved from dry camp to dry camp for 7 weeks before we were rescued by Salvadorian intelligence agencies and their special forces. But anyway, getting back to that, I did not meet Barry. I didn't meet Carl Jung. We all kind of knew each other's names at that time that we were active because we were all living that world and that lifestyle. You have to bear in mind that the people that I was involved with, like El Chapo, I have a picture of me with him when he was 26 and I was 28, and we were just moving marijuana at the time. And good God, look what he turned into. I couldn't believe it. It was just, and I ran into him years later in Culiacan. I was at a cartel wedding, very nice wedding. And we're sitting there and my wife and the other wives are across this little plaza all together. And then I was at the table of bosses as an honored guest coming down from the Northwest. And these guys walk in with AK-47s. Los Tigres de la Norte was the band playing that night, a very famous band, and they stopped playing instantly. And these guys come in and they cleared the area for security purposes, and then in walked El Chapo. And by now, El Chapo is the head of the Sinaloa drug cartel. This was in the, I believe, 91. And
so
I'm
he
sitting at,
ultimately took over for Escobar long range. Would that be a fair statement?
well, yeah and no, both. There were other people involved. Miguel actually went down to Colombia, negotiated business with Don Pablo, and then later negotiated business with the other cartel over in, oh my God, the Cali cartel. And anyway, but yeah, Chapo went to Colombia. He went to El Rio Negro outside of Medellin and did meet with Don Pablo Escobar and agreed to fly. They agreed to move like 1 or 2 tons of cocaine within 48 hours for him to prove that he could do it. And Don Pablo said, if you do it, we're in. If you don't, you're dead. Bottom line. So what he did is he created a Angel de Cielos. The pilot that flew for him was based in Juarez. And he became the one that moved the famous 70 tons of cocaine through the airlines and all of that stuff. I think that show Narcos shows kind of that. And that was pretty factual. But yeah, later he became the main connection. Pablo was killed at that point. He became the connection for the Cali cartel. And that's when the actual massive cocaine phased in to Mexico, where it wasn't, 1,000 kilos here, 1,000. You're talking, it was multiple tons here and multiple tons there overnight. And the corridor for that was up in the state of Chihuahua. The Juarez, El Paso Juarez passage became the corridor for the main amount of cocaine flowing into the United States.
I guess when I was saying takeover, what I really meant was that the power dynamic. I feel like Escobar was the top.
He was
of everybody, and over time it shifted up to Mexico. And
you're exactly
El
right.
Chapo was kind of the biggest dude in town when he got taken down.
Well, Miguel Gallardo, Felix Gallardo became the biggest dude in town because what happened was Escobar's collapse. Before his death, his corporation, his organization was already collapsing. Cali was coming into strength. There was a lady named Griselda that was moving cocaine for Don Pablo in the state of Florida at that time, but was later arrested in Los Angeles. I'm sure you know that history. And Cali stepped in, but the corridor through the Caribbean became so heated up and there were so many losses that they had to negotiate with Mexico to do a ground transport system, getting it into the United States that way. And that's how the Colombians lost power. And Mexico became the strengthening organization, all done by Miguel. He gets the credit for that. Just amazing.
And we can't say if the CIA had any influence in that at all. And I will tell you that when I interview Javier, especially, he does not like the CIA at all.
I don't blame him. They're scary guys.
No love lost. And Mike Levine, same thing, and it goes back to Kiki Camarena and other things.
That's fascinating people that you've interviewed. I mean, those people were just frontline soldiers and real patriots. And I'm not going to go too much into CIA conversations, for obvious reasons, but I can say this: I certainly understand why there was a lot of animosity between the agencies at that particular time in history based on what was going on. But the CIA was doing what they felt they needed to do to get a handle on what was going on in Central America. They were worried about communist conflict and things to this nature developing down there and entering into the United States. So they did what they felt they had to do. I've talked to a few CIA agents. I've worked with a few CIA agents on various cases, and they were so different than the other agencies that I've been involved with. They were a lot more clandestine, if you will, with the activities that they were doing for our country and the preservation of our country. And basically, they would step outside of the standard norms of DEA or U.S. Customs or
law enforcement. They weren't law enforcement.
Yeah,
and that is a big difference. They were spies.
Yeah, they were spies.
Versus law enforcement, where DEA's law enforcement, FBI, ATF are technically all cops. Those are all cops of some kind or another.
They are, but CIA, they had their own tactics own tactics, their own methodology as to how they did things. I mean, they had relationships with high-ranking criminal organizations, people that were at the top of the list, and they were allowing them to continue to do the business that they were doing. They weren't down there busting drug dealers. They were down there intelligence gathering and utilizing that benefit for the preservation of the sanctity of the United States of America.
Or potentially facilitating.
Well, they did, in fact, facilitate. I mean, who the hell do you think was involved during the Sandinista era, Contra Sandinista conflict, when Oliver North stepped in and literally blew the hell out of one of the greatest CIA operations known in history in Central America during that time? They lost a lot of years of work was destroyed by one man's ego and wanting to have attention.
I want to have one more name out there because I'm like, you were such a rare spot. It's like, I could see the comments already. You didn't ask about this. This gentleman actually was on the same Phil Donahue episode as Mike Levine, who I was talking about earlier. His name's Gary Webb.
Yeah, I've heard the name.
He was not a cop. He was actually a reporter. And he very famously died by his own hand by shooting himself in the head twice.
Yeah, like I said, I've heard the name. I can't put it together at this time where, but you have to realize after I went to federal prison, I was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison from a life sentence. So that should give you an idea of just how much damage we did to the drug flow going on in the Pacific Northwest. DEA told me at that time of my sentencing, when they all stood up for me before the judge, and even the U.S. attorney that was involved in my case stood up and said, "Oh my God, this guy has done amazing work." The cost of cocaine in the Pacific Northwest elevated by almost $2,000 a kilo by the time I was done settling the dust of what I had helped build and create in the Northwest. That's how impactful we were. But getting back to that, when I was in federal prison, I was in Leavenworth, and I got approached. I was taken up to the warden's office, approached by two members of the Department of Justice, and they said, "How would you like to walk out of prison today, become a contractor for the Department of Justice? We'll get you back to Seattle before a judge, and this is all done, but you go to work for us." And the reason they offered me this, and this is the unique part, was because I wasn't some guy that got arrested and started telling on people to get a reduced sentence. I was a man who was in power at that time up here, who walked in on his own free will. And over the 19 months that I operated with agents in the various countries, they were able to discern through my information that I would bring forward, cases that we were developing and succeeding in. Most importantly, they knew that they could actually trust me. And trust is something that isn't given, it's earned. And especially someone like myself that came up for 15 years of my life as a high-level criminal. But, I also have a heart. I was a Boy Scout. I was a Cub Scout. I joined the United States Army. Hell, I was a paratrooper at the age of 17 going overseas. I mean, I had a pattern of discipline, learning how to be part of something where you follow orders. And when I had stepped out of the military, I was on the GI Bill going to college. Winter break came, 1974. I decided to go down and visit my village and say hi to my friends. And the next thing you know, I'm driving cars down there. And the next thing you know, I've got other students driving cars down there, and we're compartmentalizing marijuana and shipping it into the United States. This is 1975, 1976.
Was that kind of like another army? You mentioned, taking orders, doing this and that. I mean,
yeah, chain of command.
Quasi military structure, even in the cartel?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a chain of command. And you also have to, this is where it gets sensitive about how much I can release to you, but you have to earn your bones in that world in order to go. They need to know they can trust you. And it's a very high price to pay to gain that trust. And I was 27 years old when I gained that trust. And I'll just leave it at that. But the bottom line is the expansion of the cartels emanated as a result of the introduction of cocaine into the Mexican corridor. The amount of money, I mean, they were literally weighing semi-truckloads of money on scales because they couldn't count it within weeks and weeks of time that it was coming.
I know, and Escobar has like bales that are buried that still turn up to this day.
Yep, it's amazing, isn't it? They were making so much money they couldn't get rid of it. houses. The walls were lined in houses. We did that up here in Seattle. We were rotating so much money. I was moving anywhere from $10 to $14 million in cash a month down south from up here. And I can remember we had two girls that worked for us, and we get $5 and $10 bills that would fill an entire trunk of a car. How the hell are you going to bundle that and ship it south? So we just pay them to go out and convert it into 20s, 50s, and 100s. And that's what they did 7 days a week for us.
Okay, I have a question for you on that. You had mentioned that the price of crack after,
cocaine.
I'm sorry, cocaine. I'm sorry, but there is a tangential relation to crack. In the Northwest, after you got busted, it skyrocketed. And right around that time was kind of the crack epidemic as well. I believe in the early to mid 90s time frame into Clinton. And correct me if I'm wrong, cocaine has really been on the wane for 20 plus years, with fentanyl and things like that being the primary drivers. Do you have any knowledge or theories as to why, the cocaine went down? I mean, was it the crack epidemic with people dying and being locked up like crazy and stuff like you did? Or
that's not at all.
What caused the shift?
What happened in the shift was human trafficking became far more productive. You don't have to grow it. You don't have to cultivate it. You don't have to turn it into a production and create it. And you can take a human in the trafficking industry, which is in the last few years, I hear, has gone up something like 5,000%. The biggest money maker, even bigger than fentanyl, is human trafficking. And fentanyl was introduced, of course, by the Chinese. If you remember the saying back in the 1950s by Chairman Mao Zedong, who said, "We will take over the United States of America without firing a single shot through the decadence of the youth." Look at where we're at today, brother. Look at where we're at today. So yeah, fentanyl was a major change for cocaine, but the problem with the complexity of cocaine is the various stages that are created before it even hits to the borders where it's brought across into the United States. But the human, they can get captured, they're sent back to Mexico, and right away they can come up with money and get right back the next day. And it's a very productive and profitable business. As you know, I'm an author. I've written 12 books, and I have an action adventure novel series called Codename The Fox. And in there, I talk a lot about human trafficking, the sex trafficking business. It's very, very sad. I've actually bear witness to being in buildings where they were housing people that were heading north, and I'm talking children that they sell to the biggest market in the world, which is the United States of America. I mean, they're selling children in Idaho, in Montana, in South Dakota. They got people that have wealth and means that buy these young children, use them up, and they end up more often than not just simply vanishing after they are expired by use. That is what transformed the cocaine market. Cocaine in the late 70s, early 80s to the end of the 80s, all the way up into 91, 92, I guess I can take it to that point, was the major financial means of developing the cartels as to what they came to. After that, before fentanyl got into the market, human trafficking started becoming their focus, and kidnappings in Mexico, of course.
See, it seems so disturbing to me, like just the whole aspect of it. Like Pablo Escobar was not a nice guy by everything I've ever seen, and none of them were.
No.
But it seems like from the reporting I've seen that the cartels have gotten more and more and more vile and evil over this time. And maybe I'm using the wrong word, but they almost seem like they're making Pablo Escobar look like a nice guy in comparison to what it's become.
It's pretty horrible. You know, they got a guy they call the stew maker. I don't know if he's in custody or not, if he's still operational. But over there on the Baja Peninsula, he had found a way to dissolve human bodies because they were killing so many people. And this is today. They were killing so many people that they couldn't make small areas that were the grave fields and grave sites where they would take the bodies and deposit them. So they created this guy, the stew maker is what they call him. And he would dissolve human bodies, and he would run the liquid waste out into these large dugout pockets that would consume it and melt it into the soil. And I write about him in one of my books, but it's really horrible. The level of violence compared to the years when I started into what it is today. I remember in 1 year in Juarez, there was an estimated 30,000 executions in 1 year. And a lot of this news doesn't even leave the city. It's not even worthy of being in their news down there because there's so much of that activity. And I've driven on streets in those cities where you see posters on the walls with people trying to locate their family members, and groups of people holding candles in the night, praying to God for any kind of information whatsoever about a missing daughter or a missing son or a missing husband or this kind of thing. It's a sadness that came in later years that wasn't during the beginning years of the actual creation of the cartels, which would be the late 1970s to early 80s. That's when it was no longer family operated criminal enterprises, but actually became these massive cartels that controlled, and they are extremely violent. I was hit here in my house in 2020 myself, left for dead. I thought I was dead. The last knife strike in my head, I remember as I was fading away, just kind of smiling because I knew I was leaving this world and going to a better place. And of course, that's the pastor in me and my studies and understanding of what happens after physical life. But somehow I kind of got recharged. I don't know how long I was under, but I was able to crawl to the back door of one of my tenants here. And this is 2020. And I knocked on the door, and here I am on the ground, a bloody mess. And they got me up, 911 did in. And I remember letting the police officers and the ambulance people, as I'm being loaded in, I said, this was a cartel kill order. I was hit by a cartel. And they never put it in any of their records. They put it on as a high-level assault. And then I got to a forensic nurse at the hospital, and I'm in and out of consciousness as they've got a dozen doctors working on me. And I kept telling her this was a kill order. I need protection here in the hospital. They're going to hit me again. And because it was a failed kill order. And a day and a half later, I came out of a coma, immediately called a friend of mine who was one of the people who chiefly helped me develop the cocaine market in the 1980s here. And he got down there with a carload of soldiers. They got me out of the hospital. Because I am a doctor, I was able to sign out against every argument in the world. I didn't care. I needed to get to my home, where upstairs I have a security-based design where no one can get into me. And that's where we got me back. And that's where I started my recovery.
Okay, so that's only 4 years ago. That's relatively recent.
Yeah, they found me decades later. And what the FBI told me, they came by and talked to me about it, and they hit a cell in Bellingham, north here. And what we think happened is by circumstance, by chance, by exposure, whatever, they found out that Hal Bradley was living in Everett. And as a result of that, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I think there's some still ongoing investigative aspects to the attempted murder of me.
You never changed your name or anything like that, or WITSEC or anything?
Never went into that because I was never afraid of anything that I'd made the choices to do. You got to realize I spent 15 years of my life in the cartels, actively involved around many horrible things. I'm well aware of what my enemy could do, but I'm also aware of exposure elements that they tend to want to avoid. And after I was released from prison, did 17 years undercover, I'm plugged into the Department of Justice now at this point. And hitting a guy like that can be extremely dangerous to the development and preservation of a cartel operational in a certain or specific region. They don't run around killing DEA agents anymore. Look what Kiki Camarina's death did to them. They learned. Well, contractors are the same kind of a thing. They recognize that we're governmentally levelized and involved. That's not like hitting a rat or a snitch.
But they didn't recognize it in 2020. They do today, but they didn't in 2020?
Well, I put a man, the Beltran Leyva organization is no longer existent. However, there are cells of the Beltran Leyva organization throughout the United States operational in unison with various other cartels. The ones that found me, we believe, was one of those existing cells that was formerly Beltran Leyva. And I had put Miguel Beltran Leyva's grandson in federal prison. I took him down on a 10-kilo coke bust in Seattle, and he escaped federal prison and got back to Mexico. And we believe because the cell had one time been affiliated with that family, that quite by accident, we don't really know yet how they found me. They went ahead and instituted a kill order that had been put out decades ago. And yeah, you're right. It's really risky for them to do that and dangerous. But And I retired out of operational work in 2018. So I was already off the books, 2 years before they found me and hit me. But such is a life and the choices we make, my friend. I felt that I owed society a very big debt, and I just didn't think saying I'm sorry was enough. I gave 17 years of my life undercover to show all of you that I really, truly am sorry for what I did. And this was my way of paying back. My doctorate is in pastoral counseling. I spent 13 years to get that doctorate, and I'm a certified hospice chaplain. I work with hospice that are homeless. So whenever down here, Providence, if a specific homeless case arrives to them, more often than not, they'll give me a quick call and say, "Hey, Pastor, we've got another one in here." And because I know, the homeless community, I left the pulpit. I was a senior pastor of my own church. I left that church to work specifically in the dope houses and the homeless camps. And that's what I've done for 19 years. And all the way up until 2018, I was not only a pastor, but the phone would ring and I'd pack a bag and I'd be on my way to some foreign country the next morning. I'm sorry. I would really like to direct at this point in segment of this interview, start looking at the aftermath of what I had survived and what I had gone through, to where it formulated into the specific purpose of why we created the Crisis Victory show, to show that extreme people can come out of extreme crisis events and convert into a humanitarian scale and basis. And this is really to me, this is the pivotal point of this interview, because that's exactly what the purpose of life becomes for people like myself that have truly been through horrific years and years of horrific life, and take that vantage and the wisdom and the knowledge of surviving such life, extreme life, and being able to utilize that to where you fit into the servitude that, like I do, for instance, working in the dope houses. These people don't trust anybody in the world. But because that I had been a former cartel member, the language that I speak, the way that I approach them, things to this nature, trust was earned and gained as a result of surviving both sides of the fence. Like I said, 15 years around the cartels and 17 years as an operative. It's pretty remarkable to be a pastor with that type of a background credential that is not only verifiable, but through your actions and the way that you reach people like this. Brother, I can remember people going down on arrest in a foreign country where I'd walk over there and put a hand on their shoulder and pray for somebody, and they would start weeping, and they're not mad at me. They're thankful it's over. That kind of thing comes into play when you allow that part of yourself that no longer judges what other people do or have done, but rather accepts that they're still a human being, for God's sakes, and somewhere within their foundation of whatever they have been brought up in or what they've gone through can become a humanitarian benefit. And
now, do you meet with other people who have, I don't know, backgrounds or whatever, when you're talking about your show? And I'm just throwing names out there. I don't know if it's necessarily that, but like a Michael Franchese, who I believe is.
I'll be interviewing him. I understand he's already been approached, but yes, I've done a lot of mob guys and stuff like that on the show already. But,
okay. Does that help you? Does that help you too? When you just kind of comparing and contrasting, like, if we were all guilty of some sins or whatever it is, it kind of makes me think of AA. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but it kind of makes me think of something similar.
Man, that's a good introduction to that. AA, NA, those kind of things don't even compare to the extremity of the type of people that I have interviewed so far that were organized crime, family connected, women that worked in prostitution around high-level clients, things to this nature. What I do like is that they are able to communicate with people that are still caught up in that type of lifestyle because they have a prior history. So people are willing to listen to them and learn from them, such as myself. At my residence here, I've lived in the same house 21 years this year. And a lot of people that have like felony warrants out on them or stuff like this, rape victims, drug overdoses, people are brought to my residence at all hours of the day and night. And I have Narcan kits that are provided by the Veterans Administration because they know I do this type of work. And people will say, well, that lady just got gang raped by 5 guys and robbed for the couple bucks she had in her pocket. Why the hell would she be brought to your house, Pastor? And I said, well, she has felony warrants. She goes to a hospital. They're going to take her into custody, and she's going to be dope sick, and she's going to go through all this. So rather than see her not go anywhere, I'm glad that I have become trusted as a foundation of servitude, if you will, to that type of a community. My ministry is extreme, sir. It's extreme. I deal with people that are really going through it in hard ways. And I had a picture I just sent to Pete recently of a girl who was brought here. She was dead. She'd OD'd on fentanyl and couldn't revive her. It took me a long time. We're just getting ready to call the 911 in, and I chest compressed her back to life after blowing 2 Narcan kits in her nose. And her boyfriend took a picture of it because he wanted to show her later how stupid she looked and how mad he was and whatever. But the point is this: I get probably 3 or 4 of those a year that are brought to me that are overdosed, and I'm ready to take that on and ready to serve that community because they don't trust the norms of the community that we exist in. They don't trust the hospital staff from not turning them in. They don't trust the police because of the way that they're looked at, if you will, by so many people in society. What they do trust is somebody that has lived their life, a similarity that they can conform to, and it creates a comfortable basis of ministry for the type of ministry that I do now in my life.
So you try to treat it as a health issue versus a criminal issue.
I don't look at what they've done at all. I look at serving God in the kingdom that I have served now for decades, and I look at being grateful for being here. Last week, I had Thanksgiving dinner, my 19th one, where I have homeless people come into my home. And I have a beautiful home, and I'm happy for them because they walk into the fragrance of a home-cooked meal, and the house is nice. My home is alcohol, drug-free, so they get to be in an environment for a few hours that maybe when their childhood, it's reminiscent of better memories of their life. And I'm willing to do that because I truly love them and I care for them. And there's no gain, if you will, because the glory doesn't come to us that do the servitude. It comes to God who deserves it. But the important thing is to look at every human being in a humanitarian basis with an understanding that, were you perfect? Did you come up in life and never make a single error or misjudgment? And if in fact you did, then how the hell can you judge somebody that's caught up in a moment of their life where they're going through these extreme struggles? And I truly carry that, and they truly sense it. You know, walking into a trap house where there's 3 guys sharing a needle at a kitchen table and 15, 16, 17-year-old girls are sitting on a couch waiting for their turn to go into a bedroom to trade their flesh for a $20 hit and not judging them ever. This was the success that came as a result of years of, by example, showing these communities, yeah, I'm here. If there's a situation, give me a call. I'll be right there. No problem. And they know that I'm not going to report anything. I stay to my vows of confidentiality. And what I'm trying to do is be the example, as Jesus Christ told us to be. Instead of saying words and acting out in those kind of ways, just be the example. Show them that you care for them. You know, I had a rape lady here that was here, I think 3 months ago, 72 years old, gang raped by 5 guys. And not only did they use their penises, but they used foreign objects up inside her body. I mean, they really desecrated this woman. They robbed her and hauled her away to a house and raped her. And when she was delivered here, it was a knock on my security door at 3:00 in the morning. I go out there and there's an unconscious woman laid out there and on my steps. So I go out there, I bring her in here, put her on a couch, and I let her take the time to explain to me what was happening. I didn't intervene. I knew that it was serious because I saw blood on her clothes and I saw, you know, markings where they showed physical abuse. 72 years old, out there smoking fentanyl and got robbed for what she had. I let her stay here for 2 days. I showered her up, did her laundry, let her have that time of sanctity, if you will, in a place where she knew she wasn't going to have to trade her body or whatever to have a couch to sleep on that night. I think it's very important that we in society recognize the element that causes such good people to end up in that state of life in the moment. Now, this lady had lived 7 decades. You know, I'm in my 70s. I understand the different stages of life and all that. But can you imagine her self-esteem issues? Can you imagine physical recovery from being raped like that? Can you imagine the psychological trauma resultant to knowing that her life meant nothing whatsoever to other people? And then somebody reaches out a hand to this person that doesn't want anything from her for sleeping on a couch for 2 nights. That doesn't ask for nothing other than the patience to sit there and wait for them to release to you, the caregiver, just exactly what they just experienced and how they deal with it dramatically and what they are going to reintegrate into once they leave my environment in 2 days, because I'm not a babysitter. I'm here in the moment for extreme events that happen to people like that. But I think that that's a really good word for that. That's exactly what it is. But I had a lady, another rape victim that came back. She was like 18 or 19 when she was brought to me, and she was a heroin addict and selling her body and got impregnated. And so she was brought here. She spent about 4 or 5 days at my house. And 2 years later, she comes back and she's got a husband. She's been off drugs and prostitution since she left my house and just wanted to come back and thank me and introduce me to her husband, who was in tears because he was deeply in love with her. They were pregnant again with another child. And she just said, Pastor, you didn't ask for nothing. You didn't make me trade my flesh for a night in your home or a meal or anything. And she says, I hadn't had that kind of treatment in a few years. She was a former runaway, left home at 13 because of things happening in her family house. But, just that moment of kindness for a day or two to an absolute stranger. And look at how that life changed forever. And that person now has a testimony that they can take forth and share to the world. And more goodness culminates as a result of surviving a crisis event. I'd love to get her on my show, but I don't know where they're at now.
That's actually a perfect point to wrap up on, because I literally was listening to all this darkness and wanting to ask, is there any hope? But you came through in the end and just gave me a hopeful story, because I am hopeful that things may be improving, but I don't think that. I think it's hard to see. One of my favorite quotations of all time is Hemingway. How did you go bankrupt? Yeah. Slowly at first, and then suddenly. Yeah. And I feel like
I remember that writing in Ernest Hemingway. I'm trying to think of the book that was in, but I do remember that. It's funny.
I'm hoping that some of these problems, like the fentanyl crisis, I've seen lately, there seem to be some signs that it may be waning slightly. Do you think that is the case? I mean, there's obviously countervailing evidence with like Trank, which is very scary looking, and other things, but is it getting better? Do we have a more hopeful future?
Well, based on working the streets every day of my life, like I do, and the information that is brought to me as a result of people that come by to pray with me or share whatever event they're experiencing at that time, yes, I am seeing a decline in my own community. It's getting better. But I also think that politically, that China is being looked at very strong right now. They are the number one provider of fentanyl, of course. And I think that we're going to see major scale activity as a result of decisions that should have been made a damn decade ago over that is going to alter this. There are so many factors involved in how do we become a better alliance to one another as Americans and representatives as ambassadors when we are in other countries. But you're very, very wise in that remark. It tells me that you are paying attention and you are dialed in, because we are seeing a slow transformation coming from the darkness and starting to head into the light. I think it takes extreme events, don't you, to create that within ourselves as individuals, to understand, more importantly, how do we become more of a humanitarian and seek the life that we desire for ourselves by lifting up others to help us get to that point. And that is my conclusion to this interview. I think that to love one another as he loved us is critical and vital. And I think it is transforming the streets. I'm just a little small-time pastor, that works with that environment. We need more people that can be ambassadors to a humanitarian way of approaching our neighbor, our community. We need to become an example. And that, my friend, is when we are going to see the transformation that we all seek and desire. Amen.